Hey, Booklord, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How
Oh
are you
man,
this
what's in
morning?
here?
Excellent, excellent.
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, I just said excellent.
Oh, good. All right, can anybody in the audience, can you just type in general if you can hear both me and Booklord here, so I know the audio is working?
Mm-hmm.
Sounds great. I'm curious. Maybe you noticed that when I started the event, it gave me the option to let at everyone know. Um, I posted something in the announcements, but did you get some other kind of notification? Anything like that?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, yeah. Did you see like a pop up in Discord or anything? I'm just curious on what it means by,
Oh,
um, let everyone know.
um, yeah, I got an email letting everybody know about the event. And I have the link right now to the speaking event. Um,
Okay.
but other than that, I'm not
Hmm.
quite sure.
Wonder what it means then. Yeah, because like when I popped into this stage channel, it had this pop up screen that came up to me and said, "Do you want to start the event?" And I said yes, and it said, "Do you want to let at everyone know?" I said yes. I'm just wondering, like, does that do anything? Like, I don't see anything posted anywhere except for where I posted in announcements just now, but I don't see. But apparently, it doesn't do anything because you didn't get a pop up. Um, did anybody else get a pop up of some sort? Let me know in general if you did. I'm more just curious than, but how Discord works than anything else.
It doesn't look like I can share my screen. I was hoping to do that so that I could access my Google Slides, but I also have images of slides as well that I can upload to the whiteboard.
Yeah, unfortunately, Discord doesn't support screen sharing or video for the speaker's corner or for stage events. But you should
All
be
right.
able to type in the speaker's whiteboard. Oh, I gotta.
Mm-hmm. Sure thing.
Let me actually
I
clone
will
that.
get that started. All right.
Hang on.
Oh, that's the wrong folder. Okay. Yep.
I'm deleting
All
that
right.
that channel. I have to make a new one. So sorry about that. I forgot to do that before.
No problem.
All right, should be cleared out now. Can you just test to see if you can type in the speaker's whiteboard? Make sure your permissions are okay.
Okay, so that you do that. And we're talking about which one are we talking about? Which
Okay,
one do
I'll make
I
sure
type
you.
in?
The speaker's whiteboard. It's just above
Oh
the
yeah, I
stage
can see
channel.
that just fine.
Can you type
Yeah.
in it? It won't allow anybody else to type in it. Will you? Can you type in it? It's meant so that you can share things like your Google Slides, for example. You could share it there, or
Okay.
it sure is. Okay,
All right. So
sounds perfect. So yeah, if you want
yeah.
to
Mhm.
calling it, yeah. Thanks, hats off. I appreciate that. They're just letting me know which one to delete, but yeah, good one. Anyway, okay, yeah. If you want to share your link to the Google Slides in the speaker's whiteboard, I'll follow through on my end so it shows up on the video, and then
Oh,
obviously anybody who's listening can
yep.
follow through while you're talking.
Excellent.
Does that sound okay to you?
All right. Yeah. Yeah. That's fine. All right. So
All right, sounds good.
um.
Well, real quick, so thank you everybody for coming. Really appreciate you being here today. We do have our event today is to speak on the ontological argument for God's existence, but Cord's going to be presenting for us. And apparently he's going to tie in Darth Vader, so I'm excited to see how that works out. We do have a few other events scheduled, a couple more. If you look on the left panel at the top, you'll see the events tab, and that will let you know what's planned. But for now, Booklord's posted a Google Doc in the speaker's whiteboard. I'll be following along with that if you're watching later. But Booklord, thanks for coming on. If you could just let us know a little bit about yourself, what your interest is in apologetics, and then let us know why you think the ontological argument is a good argument for God's existence.
Yeah. I will certainly do that. First, I want to make sure that you'll have access to the document. Scott has told me that it's just requesting access right now. Um, oh, okay, so that's there. Well, yeah. So I'm the book lord. My real name is Nicholas. But I've been interested in apologetics for, I'd say, a pretty long time. I grew up in the church, and then a few, like maybe about a year ago now, um, I had what one might call a dark night of the soul, and I started like really seeking, like, okay, are there actually good reasons to believe in God, to believe that Christianity is true? And so, I'm talking about this as I'm trying to. Um, there we go. So that should work for the Google Slides. Um, but then I just started getting really interested in the philosophy of religion, and so I've kind of been on a journey to understand the nature of reality better since then. So yeah. Um, but that is the personal note. So also a side caveat. I work late nights, so I'm pretty tired this morning.
Oh,
So if I sound uh, like I got a lot of notes to go through and um, hmm, it's not super clear, I'll do my best. But yeah, just bear with me. So
no worries.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Um, So I want to start with some questions just to ponder. The first one is just like, what does it mean for something to exist? Like, in what way does something exist? Does it exist just like an idea in the mind, like, a book might, like in J.R. Tolkien's mind, the idea for the Lord of the Rings existed? Um, this is something that one of my friends who was an agnostic for a really long time would badger me about. It's like, what does it mean for God to exist? And I'd be like, I he exists, gosh dang it. Um, but yeah, so that's one question to consider. Another is it possible for God to exist? And this is going to be the crucial one for the modal ontological argument, at least the one that I'll be presenting. Um, and if it is possible for God to exist, then how? Does he exist like in the mind? Does he exist metaphysically in the same sense that if you're a realist, like a mathematical realist, you might think that numbers exist or certain theorems exist, logic exists, the laws of logic. Um, and then another important question is, what does it even mean to be God? So these are just some questions to have in your mind while I'm going through this. Um, and they're just kind of fun to think about. So, all right. Um, One thing that's really important for this formulation of the MOA, as I'm going to call it, because saying modal ontological argument 50 times is just going to take a while. So it's structured using a kind of logic called S5. S5 deals with the idea of possible worlds. And what possible worlds are exhaustive descriptions of the ways reality could have been. Or rather, exhaustive descriptions of reality. So when you think of a possible world, it's really easy to think of something like my dad and I just watched Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness a few days ago. So it's really easy to think of like, an alternate dimension or something like that. Um, but try to like stray from that view because it's more about an entire description of reality. So there might be a possible world out there where unicorns exist or where dragons exist. Um, or there might be a possible world out there that is exactly like this one, except the sky is red. Um, that certainly doesn't seem impossible. So the way to conceive possible worlds is just to say that there are ways that reality could have been. And so for necessary existence, when something exists necessarily, it means that it exists in all possible worlds, like every single one. Um, another way you could put it is there is no possible world in which it fails to exist or fails to be actualized. Something like, again, if you're a realist in these terms, would be numbers and logic. I wish I could give more examples than that, but those are the only two that I could think of at this time. Obviously, there's God, but that's something I'm trying to argue for. So, using both necessary existence in the framework of S5 logic, we get this formulation of the modal ontological argument. I've always heard this particular formulation attributed to Plantinga. Joe Schmidt attributes it to Plantinga. He's the Majesty of Reason. And so I'm just going to call it, this is one of Plantinga's MOAs. So he may have more. I don't know. But the first premise is the possibility premise. It is logically possible that a maximally great being exists. And so using S5 logic, and implicit in the definition of maximally great being is necessary existence. So it follows, therefore, that 2, if 1, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. So if it's logically possible, then a maximally great being obtains in at least 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 possible worlds. But then it follows, since it has necessary existence, that it exists in every possible world. So there is no possible world in which a maximally great being fails to exist. But then, by S5 logic, premise 4, a maximally great being exists in the actual world, which is our world. I don't think anyone denies that this is, in fact, the actual world. And then it would follow premise 5. If 4, then a maximally great being exists. And the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. And so one thing that I was thinking about before I gave this full presentation was, are we justified in classifying God as a maximally great being? Like, could God be like a quasi-maximally great being? Well, it just seems to me that throughout the history of philosophy, from way back to the ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, in ancient Judaism, because there were a great deal of rabbis and teachers who were very concerned with, like, okay, what is God exactly? And it's always been conceived of as a perfect being. And so perfection and maximal greatness, they're kind of interchangeable. Like, the way I see it from my perspective, maximal greatness, maximal excellence, perfection, omnipotence even, they are kind of interchangeable. I understand that I think Plantinga does have a distinction between maximal greatness and maximal excellence, but I'm just not quite so sure about that yet. I haven't looked into it, but for now, that's what we will not assume, but stand on. So then we will look at the possibility premise. It is logically possible that a maximally great being exists. So there are two ways to go about critiquing the argument. One is to critique this premise, say that no, it is impossible that a maximally great being exists. The second way we'll get into later. That's where the Darth Vader part comes in. That seems to me to undermine this formulation of the MOA. The possibility premise has to be false. So it has to be logically impossible for a maximally great being to exist. In other words, a maximally great being is an incoherent term. It's a square circle. It's a married bachelor. It's a non-awesome dinosaur. Something like that. But through the work of different philosophers, I just don't think that people have shown that a maximally great being is logically impossible. So first, we have to define what is a maximally great being, and I've said it's a being that has all the perfections. And so what are all the perfections? What does it mean to be perfect? And so Richard Swinburne, in his discussion with Graham Oppy on friction a few months ago, maybe 1 or 2 months ago, attributes to God one property, omnipotence. Joshua Sijuwati also attributes only this property, omnipotence, to God in his argument from fundamentality. That's from his discussion with Josh Rasmussen on Capturing Christianity. But I think it's good just to attribute to God omnipotence, because then we actually get into a good, cogent definition of omnipotence. And so the way R.T. Mullins describes it in his interview with The Analytic Christian in a review of the video they did, or rather, a video they did in review of a crash course video on philosophy. Um, he defines it as omnipotence is having all the powers and absolutely no liabilities. So a maximum great being is only going to have um, powers. He's going to have all the powers that make him more powerful, like limitlessly powerful if you can get there. And he's going to have absolutely no limits on his power. And so, from my standpoint, this would resolve the classic stone objection. Can God make rocks so heavy that he can't lift it? Mullins provides two solutions to the paradox in the video. The one I think that is the best is that heaviness is really a relative term. I'll try not to get into this really quickly, but too deeply, but I'll just survey it. So heaviness is kind of relative. What if we just classified it as being an unmovable stone? That seems just about the same as being heavy. So imagine God creates a stone that fills every single space that he's made. So there's literally no space to move the stone. It's absolutely impossible to move the stone because there's just no space. And then so, bravo, God's made a stone that he can't move. Then he'll just annihilate it and done. No paradox. There are other ways to solve it, as he says, but I kind of like thinking about these ways to slide past the classic, what do you call them, challenges to the coherence of a maximum being. Yes, so it just seems to me as well that failing to exist would be a liability. I probably should have defined liability, and I have it there in my notes, which is just limits to a being's perfection. So, like, I am liable to sin. I am liable to be tired. I am liable to drink a monster at 11 o'clock at night. That's probably a really dumb idea. So it would seem that I am liable to do those things, and I'm also liable to fail to exist. Like I said, there's a possible world where perhaps I don't exist, Matt doesn't exist, all of you don't exist, Discord doesn't exist. It's possible. So in this next slide, I have two arguments. Well, actually, it's just what I was talking about. The first argument is pretty basic. I think the conclusion is unquestionable. It just goes premise one: if I could fail to exist, then I am not omnipotent. Premise two: I could fail to exist, and then it follows logically that I'm not omnipotent. And so the argument that I apply to God then is that if God could fail to exist, then he is not omnipotent, because it really does seem that failing to exist would be a liability to a maximally great being's power. The second premise is God is omnipotent by merit of his nature. He's always been conceived of as a perfect being. This is the best way to characterize God, it seems to me, and to many other philosophers. Well, I'm not a philosopher, I'm just an amateur. Premise three is, therefore, God cannot fail to exist, so detailed by his omnipotence, and then the conclusion follows that therefore God exists. Now, this all seems very easy, and if you look, there's Grandmoppy, the king, being like, you're not going to prove God's existence just yet. He has an excellent book on ontological arguments and belief in God. Why did I say excellent? I haven't even read it yet. All right. So this is where the Darth Vader part comes in. And this is the second way that some folks go about critiquing the argument, is to provide parodies. So the first premise is, it is logically possible that a maximally great Darth Vader exists. It doesn't seem prima facie that a maximally great Darth Vader could fail to exist. I mean, Darth Vader is pretty darn cool, but as we'll see, I have my own objections to this point, obviously. And the second premise is, if one, then a maximally great Darth Vader exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. You get the picture. And then we end up with the conclusion 5, then a maximally great Darth Vader exists. But we'd all agree that that's kind of absurd, because Darth Vader, and this is where the question of how does something exist comes in handy. Darth Vader only exists as a fictional character. He exists in literature, in movies, in video games, in cosplay, but he doesn't like truly obtain in the actual world. But by this argument, we have not just Darth Vader, but a maximally great Darth Vader, whatever that looks like. So the question is, does this parody even work? Um, this fellow on the bottom left, Apologetic Squared, did an excellent video where he, in one part, talked about something called atomic properties. So atomic properties are essentially the most fundamental characteristics of something. Um, and so when we look at a maximally great Darth Vader, when we break it down into its atomic properties, we get being Darth Vader and being maximally great. So by this logic, it doesn't seem conducive to Darth Vader that he has maximal greatness. It's kind of just thought experiment. So also, Darth Vader is clearly a contingent being. He has liabilities. He's evil. And he can only exist in a body. Obviously, Anakin Skywalker's all cut up. He's only got one arm. He needs all this stuff to live. And so maximal greatness, however, is a more atomic, well, it is an atomic property, but it's distinct from being Darth Vader. And maximal greatness doesn't seem to entail that something is indeed Darth Vader. See. And so on the right side, I have, like, what if we even suppose if Darth Vader were maximally great? So what if, well, obviously I'm just going to restate the question. Anyways, so if Darth Vader were maximally great, he would be omnipotent. So he would have all the powers and absolutely no liabilities. So he would be eternal, he'd have limitless power, he'd be omniscient, and he would have moral perfection. These are traits that we normally attribute to God. He also wouldn't have any liabilities. He wouldn't be tied to contingent body. He wouldn't be morally fallible. He'd obviously have all his body parts if he had a body at all. So, but essentially, you get a Darth Vader that no longer looks like Darth Vader. Because if you have an eternal Darth Vader with limitless power, who's also omniscient and is morally perfect, you lose the Sith part. You lose the slaughtering of younglings. You lose him being tied to a contingent body. You lose him needing to have this massive fleet of troops and stormtroopers and starships to hunt down the Jedi to maintain power in the galaxy. He could just do it with a snap of fingers. You essentially just have a being that's God. He's lost all his Darth Vader-ness. So it seems to me then that a maximally great Darth Vader would just be God. He wouldn't resemble anything like Darth Vader. So that is, I think, all I had for the presentation. Everybody take a look at the bonus T-Rex. I just stuck that in there for fun. But yes, you've made it through the talk. Congratulations. Here's a T-Rex. And then I have my resources that I pulled from as well. So, yeah, thank you for having me on.
Sounds good. Well, thanks so much for that. If you do have questions, comments, concerns, or objections, you can hit the little hand icon at the bottom of your screen. That'll put you in the queue. And then once you're in the queue, I'll be able to send you an invite, and then you can interact with Booklord directly. One thing I would ask if you could just clarify, as far as the talk of possible worlds, could you clarify whether or not by saying there are these other possible worlds that we're committed to their actual existence? So would it be like a possible world just be like a different world, or are these like non-existent possible worlds?
Oh, yeah. Possible worlds are a, what do you call it? Like useful fiction? They're a tool that's used in talk on S5 logic. They don't actually exist. I mean, I've heard that perhaps there are philosophers out there who argue that they would. That's kind of weird, but we're talking about theoretical worlds here. So it's not like, no, you have to believe like all these possible worlds actually exist. I think that would make them actual and not possible. Well, I mean, actuality possibility. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So would it be then fair to say that, let's say that this is a dorky example, but it seems possible that that Napoleon hadn't agreed to the Louisiana Purchase in American history. And so, would it be logically equivalent to say, on the one hand, it's possible that Napoleon hadn't sold all that land to the America, to the United States, and that's equivalent to saying, in some possible world, Napoleon doesn't sell
Yeah.
the that
Yep.
land tract to the United States.
Yeah. Exactly.
Perfect. Sounds good. Just want to clarify that. All right. Well,
Yeah.
Caleb, I've got an invite out to you to come on up and interact with Booklord. Thanks for coming on. What's on your mind?
Welcome. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, hear you just fine.
Great. Hi, Book Lord. First of all, good job on the presentation. I'm also a theist and Christian, so it's always nice to have. I feel like we have more skeptic presentations, but actually, maybe that's not true. It's about even. But anyway, yeah, thanks for doing that. I had a comment and a question. The comment was just kind of a minor thing when you were asking earlier, not asking, stating like, I think this is planting this version. You are correct that it is, although that's William Lane Craig's formulation of Plantinga's. Plantinga's version's like that, but it's more technical, and so as far as I understand, that's great. Like giving more of a pop level kind of understanding of that, but that's not that important. I was just clarifying that. The thing I was going to ask is I agree with you that I don't think that the parity arguments are very good. I think the more interesting ones are reverse ontological arguments, and I don't
Hmm.
think you address those. So, like for example, Peter Van Inwagen, who's a theist but is skeptical of that argument, has
Right.
an argument kind of like that where he says, or he talks about the idea of a no-no, which is KNOWNO, right? And a no-no is this hypothetical being that knows that there is no maximally great being, and so he's like, there's a possible world in which a no-no exists. If there's a possible world in which no-no exists, then there's a possible world in which a maximally great being can't exist. But if there's one possible world in which a maximally great being exists, he can't be maximally great. Therefore, maximum great being does not exist. Or people do it where it's possible the maximum great being does not exist. If he doesn't exist in one world, if he doesn't exist, he doesn't exist in one possible world. If he doesn't exist in one possible world, he can't exist in any possible world. Etc. It just gets you to the reverse conclusion. So, I guess would you go about that by questioning the first premise of saying, well, like it's incoherent that a maximally great being couldn't exist? But I feel like that's what we're debating in the first place, right? So, how would you go about addressing that?
Right. Um. Yeah. The reverse ontological arguments. They're pretty challenging, and I don't have like a clear like irrefutable answer. I don't think anyone can. But one thing I'll say is that um, let's see. But let's take the first premise of the reverse ontological argument, or at least one version of it. Is logically possible that a maximally great being doesn't exist. Um, I actually don't think that that premise is true, and that's a pretty big claim. So, and the reason for that is that a maximally great being, would seem to have necessary existence. So, like Ben Arbor once commented, the late Ben Arbor, tragically deceased, um, he once commented that the statement "there is no God" even seems incoherent, which is to say that there is no metaphysically necessary being is just gobbledygook. It doesn't make sense because it exists necessarily. So um, that's one way I go about answering that. In terms of Peter Van Inwagen's example of a no-no, uh, I guess I don't really know how to answer that one. I still think that a maximally great being by nature of his being, merit of his nature, um, would still exist necessarily. Um, but then again, that would commit you to saying that the no um, could not exist. So yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that more.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I agree. I think the reverse ontological argument for me is what holds me up from that. But I actually do think I personally have a rebuttal on the no, and I left a comment on this in one of the videos, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, that's a good response." Is I would say that I don't think, and I agree with you. I don't think a no is coherent, because if a no can know that there is no maximally great being, it would be omniscient, or it would need an explanation for its existence. And so, if it's omniscient in that, I basically think the no would itself have to be the maximally great being in order to be able to have that kind of knowledge and that kind of form of
Right.
existence, and that would just be incoherent to say that it knows it doesn't exist. So. Yeah, that's how I think the reverse ones are a bit more challenging. So I don't know. I guess for the moment, I take Swinburne's view that I think God is metaphysically necessary, where kind of like how, every world in which there is a bachelor, it's unmarried, or every world in which there's a triangle has three sides just by definition. But there are worlds I can imagine in which there are no triangles. There are worlds in which there are no bachelors. But given that there is one, it's a necessary entailment. So that's kind of how I see God. Is if God exists in a possible world, he has to be metaphysically necessary. I don't know if I'm committed to say he's logically necessary, but I think your presentation has got me a lot to think about. So thanks for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for your thoughts.
All right. If anybody else has any comments or questions, go ahead and hit that the hand icon to go into the queue. In the meantime, one thing that Caleb brought up there at the end that I think will be a hang up that a lot of people have is why I think that logical possibility entails metaphysical possibility. So, for example, Caleb gave, if I can, essentially, he didn't say this in so many words, but essentially, if I can imagine it, then it must be some possible world, right? So if I can imagine a unicorn, then in virtue of my being able to imagine it, that therefore there must be such a possible world. Graham Oppie says that every possible world has to have a causal history with our own, and so that if there's no way to get to that state of affairs from our initial starting conditions, then it would end up being not a possible world. So that even if it's not logically contradictory, it could nonetheless be metaphysically impossible. So do you have any comment on why it's the case that if something's logically possible, that is free from contradictions, that it therefore is possibly actual?
I guess I would appeal to the notion of necessary existence. That's the real crucial part of the argument. And it seems to me that a that maximal greatness entails necessary existence, and things like unicorns and dragons don't have those things. They're not omnipotent. I understand that, like, as I'm thinking about it, I think that my view might be a little bit narrow. Again, lots of views tend to be. So uh, let's see. In terms of Oppie's idea of possible worlds, I guess I have my reservations because, like, it seems that possible worlds can, have a different kind of history than our world has, at least as far as we know. Um, but that, let's see, still by merit of God's nature, he would still exist, even if, you have all these possible worlds that are causally connected or causally related to our own.
Yeah, I also am not too persuaded by Oppie's rebuttal there, because I don't think it that carries the water that he wants it to. Because the problem is, like, it's one of those arguments that I think proves too much. Because if the case is that, like, well, logical possibility is not the test, it has to have a causal history with our own. Well, how do you know what's going to have a causal history with our own? Well, you don't. And so what that would mean is that we can't know any counterfactuals. Like, we would literally not be able to know any counterfactuals because we have no idea whether whether the causal history of our world would actually lead to that state of affairs. So I literally, like, I don't know if I flip a coin and it lands heads, I don't know if there is a possible world where it ends up coming up tails instead. And so with Oppie's response, since we obviously can know counterfactuals, and since his account would have us not knowing any counterfactuals, it seems like it's not a good epistemological model. But anyway, we do have some people in the queue here. Let me go ahead and send an invite out to Son of Leto. Hey, Leto, how you doing? Or Son of Leto, I guess. Letoson.
Hello there.
Can you hear me?
Yep, hear you fine.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Book Lord, nice presentation. Really enjoyed it. So I got a question that kind of bleeds off of Matt's question. The first premise is there, and let me read it out verbatim here. It is logically possible that a maximally great being exists. So why would we assume that it's logically possible versus logically impossible? And it does this apply in some way to probability? Because couldn't
Oh, I think you cut it out there, Leto.
All right, so if he comes back, from what I understand, the question has to do with. Oh, golly gee whirlikers. I just forgot.
Yeah, he was asking about like why think that it's logically possible that God exists rather than logically impossible that God exists.
Oh yeah, right. Well, I think once again I love Ben Arbor's view on uh, that particular statement, and Chad McIntosh also talks about this in his paper on like the modal appearances of things. But it has to do with like here you have two claims. The first claim is that it's possible that God exists, logically possible, because there are different kinds of possibilities. Um, and then the second claim is it is impossible that God exists. Now, the second claim is a lot stronger than the first claim. When you're saying that's impossible, you're saying that it's logically impossible. That's a pretty heavy claim. Whereas when you say it is logically possible that God exists, it doesn't seem like that heavy of a claim. So I think that the person who wants to hold that um, God is impossible has a heavier burden to shoulder than someone who says that God is possible, especially in light of the arguments from natural theology and many other arguments besides.
Fair enough. All right, Leto. Well, I'm sorry that we lost your mic there. I'm not sure what happened. But we've got a question from Kevin. Let me go ahead and send an invite out to you. Hey, Kevin, how you doing?
Let's go.
I'm doing good so far. Bookload, good presentation. Enjoyed it enjoyed it very much. I want to present a parody argument, which goes as follows. You can follow it in the From Darth Vader to God text channel. Premise 1, it's logically possible that no being exists. Premise 2, if 1, then there is a possible world in which no being exists. Premise 3, then there can't be a being that exists in every possible world. Premise 4, then there is no maximally great being, and therefore no God exists.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting argument. Thank you for providing that. Once again, I'd appeal to um, God's nature. So that God is omnipotent, maximally great. So he would have metaphysical necessity as part of his nature. I guess I don't want to flaunt this. Well, flaunt is kind of a strong term. I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to play around with S5 logic too much because, like, I do wonder if, like, is it logically possible that no being exists? This kind of reminds me of what's called metaphysical nihilism, which is to say that nothing exists. Um, so I think it is possible that no being exists, but then I'm going to want to object to one of the premises. Um, but then that's my first response. God has metaphysical necessity, and so he would still exist. But I guess my worry is that we're fiddling too much with S5 logic. Also, okay, here's maybe a little bit of a better response for you. Is it necessary that no being exists? So my argument, the MOA has to do with a being that metaphysically exists. Your argument, seems, has to do with a bunch of beings not existing. I think perhaps the MOA is a little bit more more
Mhm.
possible or plausible than the parody that's presented here. But yeah, that would be my response.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one
That help?
other there's two other responses I'll share. One is from Josh Rasmussen. He gives a really interesting one. I think it maybe commits you to too much, but He says that, well, in this, we'll call it nothing world. In nothing world, the claim God does not exist or nothing exists, the claim nothing exists would be true. And so that proposition would be true, but propositions are mental entities. That's what a proposition is a mental entity. And so in order for a proposition to exist, there must be a mind to hold it. And so even in nothing world, it would have to be the case that there would be a mind to hold the proposition nothing exists. And therefore, paradoxically, there would be both nothing and not nothing, because there would have to be the mind to hold the proposition. So it turns out that there's a contradiction that can be derived from the nothing world after all, namely that nothing exists and something exists. That's an interesting response. I think the other one is, if we look at like what are we saying with possible worlds, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to clarify with Booklord at the end of his presentation, is that what a possible world is it's a different way that our world could be. And so if it's true that there's anything that's necessary in our world, God or not God, if it's true that there's anything in our world that's necessary, then there can be no world. The nothing world will not be possible, because there's no, and the reason why is because the existence of contingent objects implies that there's a necessary object, right? And so at least a lot of the argument from contingency. And so if there is such a necessary object in our world, then it'll turn out that, well, there is no possible world, because that object would then exist. So even if you're an atheist, if you believe in contingent objects, it seems like you're committed to the existence of some sort of necessary object. And so your worldview then would commit you to the belief that the nothing world is impossible after all.
I think this is one of the criticisms of the ontological argument, that it boils down to that everything you argue in the ontological argument is irrelevant, because you have to look at other arguments to make it to make the foundation that was already and follow something that was already followed in the other arguments. So in your case, if we go with the argument from contingency, then we already have proven, if it's sound, we have already proven a necessary thing. And this is what the ontological argument wants to prove as well. But if we have to grant the argument from contingency for this argument to make sense, then we just do the same thing.
To be
recurring
fair,
the other.
that doesn't seem quite what I've said. I said that even if you're an atheist, like for example, Graham Oppy. Graham Oppy is certainly not a theist. He's not a Christian. Nonetheless, he holds that the initial conditions of our universe, of our world, are necessary. And so Graham Oppy will say that nothing world is impossible because he holds our initial conditions to be necessary. And it seems like you are committed to the existence of something necessary. And so the parity relies on, it's possible that there's a world where nothing exists, and your own worldview, even if you're an atheist, I mean, Graham Oppy is certainly not a Christian. His worldview commits him to the claim that world is not possible.
Okay.
I think, Kevin, what you're getting at is that we seem to need to concede the success of other theistic arguments in order for the ontological argument to get off the ground. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would actually say you can do that. You can go that route, but I wouldn't say that it's necessary to do so. The thing that I do is first look at the concept of God. Is it logically coherent? Would it entail necessary existence? And I have other arguments for why God would have necessary existence besides the one that I presented here. But it would seem to me that with the ontological argument, all you would need essentially is just the idea of God, kind of like what Anselm did back in the 13th century. I don't know, but yeah, does that make more sense?
Yeah, I think so the nothing word, as Matt said, is kind of illogical. You can argue against the nothing word, but we can change my parody argument a bit and say it's logically possible that no maximally great being exists.
Right,
and we
right,
would
and that's
still
the,
follow.
that's,
Yeah.
Like Caleb said, that's one of the that's I think that's the more that's the more persuasive objection. But then, like what I said, I think that perhaps the statement "no God exists," which is to say no maximally great being exists, which is then to say no metaphysically necessary being exists, then that's just gobbledygook. It doesn't make sense. So, yeah. Thanks for sharing, Kevin.
You're
All right, Kevin,
going a
I'll
bit.
give I'll give
sorry.
you the last word, Kevin, and then we're gonna go to Scott if that's all right.
Okay. I think the ontological argument has several problems, and I would like to go back if the others don't take too long, because I have multiple other points I would like to
Yeah,
like to
absolutely.
talk
Yeah,
about.
once you go back, you can certainly come into the queue as often as you like. I just want to make sure we give different people an opportunity.
Okay, yeah, cool, wonderful. Then see you later.
Oh,
Yeah,
all right then.
thanks.
All right, Scott, I have an invite out to you. Hey, Scott, how you doing?
Thanks for allowing me an opportunity to speak.
Hello there.
And the Book Lord, do you prefer to go by the Book Lord or by Nicholas or by Nick?
Any is fine.
Okay, I will use Nick until you tell me otherwise. Excellent presentation. I really enjoyed the slides. I think those are always both helpful and entertaining as well. So that's
Yeah.
always a treat when somebody goes through the extra effort to prepare that. I'm an atheist, so I'm coming at this from a bit of a skeptical perspective. And I had jotted down several notes as you went over the slides, but I don't think I have any sort of structured criticism. One thing just because we left off of Kevin's point, it's kind of tangentially related, but I don't want to necessarily spend too long on that because maybe he wants to come back to that. But
Right.
if I understand correctly, we've defined a necessary existence as an existence that occurs in every possible world. Is that correct?
Yeah. That necessary existence, I'd say, is to say that something exists in every possible world. It always obtains. It can't fail
Okay.
to obtain.
And it seems like to me, for at least a lot of properties, if not all properties, we can think of a kind of a world complementary in that one respect. So I think Matt had mentioned the idea of a red sky versus a blue sky. So there's a world where the skies must be blue and a world where the sky must not be blue. So they don't share that property in at least that respect. They can share other properties.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a
kind
bit-
of building off of this.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I just if you could clarify the language there. It
So-
sounded like you were saying that there is some possible world when you use the word must. To me that sounded like you were saying there's some possible world in which the sky is blue in every possible world, which I wasn't. Because if it must, I don't know if you meant a necessary relation.
That wasn't the intent of the word. So maybe I might have a poor word choice. So I'm trying to think of the best word choice. What I'm trying to convey is the idea of a complement. So there is maybe it's best to say it this way, and I might have to end up changing this. But there is a world where the sky is blue, or a possible world where the sky is blue, and a possible world where the sky is not blue. So they are, in at least that respect, they are complementary.
Okay.
Sure.
So the question being is basically, is it logically possible that there are no necessary concepts, meaning there is no set of worlds that share every single set? So if we go down to like a microscopic level, so let's imagine a micro world. It's just 3 properties, a big red ball. And there's a possible world where there is a small red ball, there's a possible world where there is a big blue ball, and there's a possible world where there is a big red cube. So among those 3, there is no property shared by every single world. And so therefore there's no necessary existence in any of those set of worlds.
Yeah, I mean, though none of those objects have necessary existence, so yeah.
So is that possible of our set of possible worlds? Meaning there is no property that every possible world shares. Are you basically saying it's logically impossible for the set of worlds to have no unshared property?
Okay. So what you're saying, it seems to me, is that I would need to hold, or maybe that I do hold, that there is something that must exist in every possible world. So is that kind of what you
Yes.
were saying?
That is correct.
Okay. Well, once again, I think like what Matt quoted Rasmussen in his objection to metaphysical nihilism. I don't really think metaphysical nihilism is possible. So I would say that existence is a feature of every possible world because if it's a world, then it exists. So or rather, it has at least some property of being a world, which means that the property of being a world exists and therefore exists. In terms of, so yeah, I would say I think that might have been your whole question. So
I
right?
guess so. That it's slightly unsatisfactory because I when I think back to the
okay.
example, it's kind of different than a nothing world, a no world, like you had mentioned before, because it's not that there's nothing in this world. And
Okay.
Kevin had sort of specified simply no beings, but it's just like with the big red ball example, there is something in every single one of those worlds. It's just there is no consistent property of that thing that's in every single world. So it's a very valid world. Like we could think of an Earth, where each individual person exists, and therefore we would say no person has a necessary existence. Like there's a world where just simply I don't exist, but everyone else does, and there's a world where you don't exist, but everyone else does. And so we're not like having a nothing world where nothing exists. It's just one property. And is it possible that it is applicable to all properties? And I think your retort then is that just being a world is itself a shared property. But is that the only property? Like the fact that they're just a world and that's all there is?
Well, maybe
Well, I suppose what I was.
if I can try to just
Yeah?
understand what you're saying, Scott. I mean, Nick is committed to the existence of God, and he takes God to have the property of omnipotence. And so, since God exists in all possible worlds, there would be a being with that same property of omnipotence in every possible world. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're asking?
I mean, yes. I guess that's affirming that it's logically impossible that there is no
There is no.
unshared property between all worlds, or unshared property other than being a world.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think any
mean,
worldview that thinks that there are necessary beings would be committed to the view that those beings have their properties in every possible way. They couldn't have none of the same properties because it wouldn't be the same being. And so I think it's even
one
Oppie
thing I'd
would
like
be
to.
committed to that on your as far as you're describing it.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to say, Scott, is that we have to remember that possible worlds aren't necessarily like they're always going to be like ours. So like the cosmos. Like I gave the example of Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, where the definition of possible worlds is simply an exhaustive description of reality. So that includes material objects, immaterial objects, necessary objects like numbers and um, logical premises, and propositions. So the proposition, there is a world, there may be like a possible world in which that proposition, and maybe only that proposition, is true. Right?
Could you restate that? I'm sorry.
Right. So possible worlds are exhaustive descriptions of all reality, which includes various things. It doesn't have to include a material world. It can simply include propositions. So,
Okay.
like the proposition, there is a world, or the proposition, there is a proposition. You can have a lot of fun with that. Is like, even if that's the only thing, it's still a possible world where that proposition still obtains. So, um, yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to dig my meat hooks into game.
I don't have like I said, I don't have a structured criticism. It's just a thought that was occurring to me. I think you have some. They're not fully satisfactory to me, but I think they're on the way to maybe being satisfactory. If you want, I have some other thoughts on other points.
If you wouldn't mind, and because I still don't really understand what we're getting at, if you could just clarify like where the objection lies. You're saying that
the objection lies
it's not
to
true.
the idea. Essentially, it's being asserted that there is such a thing as a necessary property, and I'm wondering, that's basically denying that it's logically possible for there not to be a necessary property. It's kind of assuming, in a way, assuming the conclusion to the answer. It's assuming a less specific version of the you're essentially, to prove the argument, you have to assume a more general version of the response is true in the beginning.
Okay. That I think that makes more sense. Well, yeah, that is a concern that I've had. That's a concern that Rasmussen has. I mean, he shared that in his segment at the CBC2 conference, well, CBC1 conference. But I don't think it's question begging, because we just have to look at the concept of God And if we look at the what perfection entails, you avoid the question begging, it seems. Because first, I guess there's kind of two steps to the ontological argument. The first step is to look at the concept of God and see if, omnipotence, if, that's actually, if that can obtain in a possible world. And if so, does it also entail necessary existence? I think it does. Let's see. And then the next step would be to use the premises. And so, in a sense, I mean, you might be assuming something, but once again, I think that there isn't any good response or like good refutation of the coherence of a maximally great being, and so the ontological argument would follow that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts, Scott.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to move back to Kevin. I do have another line of thinking on a different note, but I don't know if you'd prefer to give Kevin a chance to
Yeah,
speak.
let me switch to Kevin.
Yeah,
If you want to
yeah.
just raise your hand real quick, and that'll put you right back in the queue,
Okay.
and we'll come back to you after Kevin. All right, Kevin, you're back on. Thanks for
I am back.
thanks for being patient.
So, all good. I would like to continue on the begging the question point because I thought about this as well, especially on the slide, does God necessarily exist? The second argument, the second premise, God is omnipotent. So, for me, it doesn't make sense that something that doesn't exist has an attribute like omnipotence. So it seems to me that you are assuming in premise 2 that God exists because for God to have the attribute omnipotence, he would need to exist. So essentially, premise 2 is God exists and has omnipotence. And then follow that God exists.
Right. I get that criticism indeed. I guess my purpose with that premise is to state that the idea of God is logically consistent. And so, if it is logically consistent, then it would follow that gods would obtain in a possible world. So, I guess I want to avoid the question begging by saying that no, first we have to take a look at the nature of God. And so, yeah, I mean, I think what you have to do in this case is to justify the premises. So I think that there are good justifications for the second premise of my little argument there. And so I don't think that it's just, blatant question begging that would therefore make the argument invalid. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, but the problem is that you try to follow from the nature, or you try to follow from the nature of something that just exists as a concept that it actually exists. And I think here's the problem, because you try to give it an attribute, like God is omnipotent, and then, but for God to be omnipotent, he would need to exist. Like we could define Kevin's son as Kevin's son, so my son. But the problem is, Kevin's son would be my son, and I would be a father, but I'm not a father. I don't have a son, but a Kevin's son would be my son by definition. So, do you see my
Right.
point?
I think so. We were saying like we kind of smuggle it into the premises of the argument. Sure. And man, I want to be able to make sure that we don't do that. And I think that what I've said in terms of giving justification for the premises, um, yeah, that's certainly given me something to think about, Kevin. Um, let's see.
Perfect.
I wonder if we're like.
Matt, do you want to?
I wonder if we're kind of like missing like the move back to the actual world. And I think maybe that's it. So like, for example, if you defined Kevin's son, a Kevi son, then you can certainly define that concept as Kevin's son. And because it's free from contradiction, as far as I can tell, we would say that there's some possible world in which Kevin's son exists, even if it's not the actual world.
Right.
The reason why we bridge back
And
to God exists in the actual world isn't because the concept of God is is simply such that he exists, but it's a logical consequence of necessary existence. So that if he exists in any possible world, he exists in every possible world. But that wouldn't be true of Kevin's son. Kevin's son wouldn't be a necessary being because he'd be your son. So he would obviously be contingent on you in any world that he exists. So I think maybe that might be the step that we're missing.
I think you're conflating two things, because in the language we use in this slide, does God necessarily exist, we don't use the words possible words and anything. We just use could fail to exist. It just, we don't have possible words here. It's just
right. Yeah, we're just taking it like you see the slides, Matt.
I'm not sure what
on
page
the
you're
slide
on, but to say it could fail to exist
Right.
is to say in some possible world it does fail to exist. Those are
kinda,
logically
yes.
equivalent.
Yes, but the problem is that we go from what I want to try to point out is that we go from a definition to something that somehow by definition exists. So we can go a step further and say, and Kevin's son exists. So Kevin's son is my son and exists, and this is the definition of a Kevin son. And then
Well, okay.
we would still go the same route.
Well,
So
I
think your
in terms
objection
of,
probably is more the way that you're looking at properties is probably more to the second premise. I think you would say God isn't omnipotent because he doesn't exist, so he doesn't have any properties. I think that would be more aligned with your
that's my
objection.
point. If there is no God,
okay.
then there is no God to have the property omnipotence, right?
Well, then I think the problem is you're starting from an atheistic perspective. So then we would need to provide justification for the atheistic perspective. And I mean, from my point of view, I think you could justify it. I just don't think that the justification is strong enough.
Well, to be fair, it's your argument, right, Nick? So it
Right,
wouldn't really be.
Right. Yeah,
He wouldn't have to defeat the premise.
true. Right. So, sorry about that. I didn't mean to shift the burden of proof.
Oh, good.
Right.
So-
And I should have clarified that these were like kind of toy arguments. So my main point was on the modal and logical argument. But go ahead.
Yeah, but it seemed to me that your model argument from the slides before in some way relies on this argument from the slide, does God necessarily exist? At least it sounded like this way when we in our previous talk on some minutes before. Yeah.
Well, I think with the possibility premise, I don't think that that's question begging because we have justification for the premise, and I provided justification for the premise that it's logically possible that a massively great being exists. So, no, I don't think that the MOA that I presented is question begging.
Okay.
I could go over some of my justification for that if you'd like.
Maybe you could clarify. I think this might connect to Kevin's objection, and then we'll give Kevin. I'll ask you to clarify, Nick, and then we'll give Kevin a response, and then we'll go to Scott. So maybe you could clarify, like, why should we believe that because it's logically possible that something exists, that therefore it's metaphysically possible, and that is to say that it exists in some possible world. So why does it simply being free from logical contradiction imply that it exists somewhere? Why couldn't it be free from contradiction, and yet exist in no possible world?
Interesting. Well, I think that perhaps if the idea of God is logically consistent, then God's existence would obtain in some possible world. Like I said, the possible worlds are a more hypothetical tool. So perhaps then that would say that we're saying that hypothetically God exists, but that's not what we're getting at. And so metaphysical existence. Perhaps a better way to state the premise then is that it's metaphysically possible that God exists. And I think that might be what Plantinga means as well. But I think, let's see. It's the let me try and say it this way. If the idea of a maximally great being is logically coherent, then it would obtain in some possible world. I think that's a reasonable view. And so, because it's maximally great, it would have necessary existence, and so it would exist in every possible world, and thus you get the picture.
Okay, Kevin will give you a response, and then we'll go to Scott.
Okay. So I'm still not sure on how much your argument relies on the argument from does God necessarily exist and how exactly they connect, because for me the second premise is not justified so far, and I'm still not sure about the connection between logically possible and a possible world. So we could go back to that at another time.
Perhaps.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. And Scott, I have an invite out to you.
Thank you for having me back.
Absolutely.
I think perhaps we can switch gears and talk about another aspect of the presentation. Something that was, I guess, I found perhaps a bit arbitrary was you had defined a maximally great being as one that has all perfections. And I wonder how we can sort of, are we making arbitrary choices in what to measure? Because we can define some properties and complementary properties. So for example, if I am maximally north, then I am minimally south. And if I am vice versa, if I'm maximally south, I'm minimally north. And whichever one we choose that we care about as far as maximizing, we are in fact minimizing the other. And how am I in fact a maximally, like how can we say maximally of anything? And is the person who is north the maximally great being in regards to their position on the earth, or is the person who is south? Like a maximally knowledgeable being, so an omniscient being, would also be minimally ignorant, and a maximally ignorant being would be minimally knowledgeable.
Yeah. I guess I'm not so sure about the relationship between maximal greatness and like minimal greatness. I would say like maximal greatness is like it's almost like in a video game where you max out, your levels. So there's like, yeah, you've minimized everything. So in a sense, you've just gotten rid of all the liabilities. So there is no minimal anything, I think, in that regard, because you've already maxed everything out. And if we're considering this like on a continuum where you have maximal and minimal, like, and minimal, I would say is just like zero on a number line, and you have God being like maxed out all the perfections, then there would be no minimal to compare it to.
Well, I think there would be minimal imperfection in that case. And that's so what this has actually failed to do is it has failed to be maximally imperfect.
Well, that I would say is a liability. And being maximally imperfect would mean that you have all the liabilities. And that's not a good thing. And yeah.
Isn't it a choice, though, which we value? Like, clearly I value knowledge. So I think having more knowledge is better than having less knowledge. But that, to me, seems like that's my anthropocentric, human-centered view. And it's not necessarily a fundamental property of the universe that being knowledgeable is better than being ignorant.
Yeah. Right. So, like, whether we value maximal greatness or, like, as you said, minimal greatness, or like the most minimal. That's kind of a weird way to put it. I still think that regardless of our perspectives of which we value more, it would still obtain. Like, one could value a universe in which no God exists, and valuing, the great value of sacrifice on that view, and perhaps some other qualities of it. But that doesn't mean that is true. Perhaps maybe I should use a different example. But I think that you can like fail to appreciate maximal greatness, and it would still taint.
I guess part of that point might be that
if you don't mind, maybe we can clarify a little bit. I think that the argument might be able to be like the objection might be able to be strengthened a little bit, because at some point, like if we say, well, if you maximize something, then you haven't maximized your lack of that thing. So at that point, we start to get into kind of word games. We're like, okay, well, that could be true of anything, So like, we can just play these word games. But what I think, what the heart of the objection is, why is it that this set of properties goes for maximal greatness? So like, why is it that maximum morality goes for maximal greatness and not maximal roundness or maximal age? So a maximal age would entail an infinite universe. So why, then it would be maximally aged in every possible world. And so, like, why is it that we have just these sets of properties that the Christian God happens to have? Why are those the only ones that go for maximal greatness? Is that fair? Is that a fair restatement, Scott?
Yes, I think that is.
Yeah. I think that's a much, a really good way to put it.
Better than I said.
No, it's all good, Scott. I get what you're saying. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember. Like I said, I'm tired. We were talking about why a maximally great being would have such and such properties and not have others. I think it has to do with like what Apologetic Square talks about in one of his videos, atomic properties. I'd have a link to the video in my resources. But like considering like the most simple properties, because that I think is what an atomic property is. Roundness seems to be a contingent upon there being something that like can make it round, so line segments, points, things like that. And so it would have like the atomic property of materiality, existence, something along those lines. So in terms of like moral greatness and like maximal power, I think that perhaps, especially if you're a moral realist, then you would say that morality is a fundamental part of the actual world. And so an atomic trait of the universe would be, like, I don't know, morality obtained. Like, or perhaps, like, I think Graham Oppie as well will also concede that the singularity that got going has like some property of omnipotence. Now, not to be confused with like limitless power, but like maximal power. So that would be an atomic property of it.
That's really interesting. I've
Yeah.
actually never heard that before. Because like maximal roundness, right? So roundness is not fundamental because it's dependent on other properties like radius and mass and things. So you're saying that like basically what we should take as maximally great properties are atomic properties. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then age also would be
being-
a function of other properties. Age wouldn't be a function of, it wouldn't be atomic because it'd be dependent on other properties.
Yes.
Is omniscience then dependent upon being there facts which to be known?
Perhaps. And I think like there are some facts which are indeed necessary, obviously. Like let's have a thought here. So let's say that perhaps omniscience, having that knowledge, maybe he knows that no thing besides me exists. So like nothing in this world yet exists. Yeah, well, just a short answer to your question. Yes, I do think that perhaps omniscience is related to there being something.
Would omniscience then not be atomic?
Sure.
It seems like you could almost say like, yeah, omniscience wouldn't be atomic, but omniscience is a consequence of omnipotence. And so if omnipotence is atomic and he's got omnipotence in every possible world, then even though it's not atomic, right? So I don't think that Nick is saying that God only has fundamental properties, because I mean obviously he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he wouldn't be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and that's a non-fundamental property. I think he's just saying that what makes for maximal greatness are the atomic properties. Whether or not they're non-fundamental or non-atomic properties that God also possesses would be kind of a separate issue.
Okay.
All right. Do you have any?
If it's all right.
Did that answer?
Go ahead.
Did that answer the?
I would have to think over it more.
Yeah, sure.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's just something
I never thought of that.
Something that seemed to be missing between, I think, slides 1 and 2 is the jump from, and maybe this is something I'm sure Plantinga addresses or is addressed in other arguments, but there was a jump from necessary being to maximally great being, and it didn't seem to be, at least in the argument presented, clear that a maximally great being is a necessary being.
Right. That's one thing that you have to do when you look at the concept of God, where is necessary existence? Well, yeah, isn't an atomic property. Well, existence, there doesn't seem to be anything dependent upon the property of existence, except that the thing exists. So existence entails existence. So that would seem to be an atomic property there as well. Um, yeah, God, I think that your objection to your objection that concerns what we value, that's kind of an anthropocentric view. That is an interesting objection that I would like to think about more. So thank you for that.
Okay. Did we want to hand back over to Kevin,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, if that's all right,
Okay.
we'll go to Kevin, and then we'll probably take one more question after Kevin, before we go ahead and close out for the day.
Yeah.
So
Wear me
whoever's-
down, y'all.
I'm
Welcome
back.
Kevin.
Go ahead.
Okay, so one problem I always had with the ontological argument is that it's kind of structured like I'm not sure if you're familiar with mathematical induction.
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, basically you have a statement and you want to prove it for every possible natural number. So what you do is you establish a rule that if it works for a number k, then it also works for k plus 1. And it seems to me that the ontological argument kind of has the structure with it has this property in one possible word, and then we can follow from that to every other possible word. And my problem is... Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, and for me, the one of the problems is that we never established the first step that there is an actual possible word. Like there was never pointed to one possible word. Like we talk about, yeah, there is some, but I want to point to some possible word. Like, how does this word look like? And I think this is one of the problems, because the only possible word we actually know about is the actual word. I think you somewhere wrote this, that our actual word is some possible word. And so for me, it seems like to prove this whole argument is that you would need to prove that God exists in the actual word which you want to follow.
Yeah. That's an interesting objection. I think in terms of possible worlds, I know that they're kind of used as a hypothetical tool, but in terms of what a possible world looks like what I said about the actual world being a possible world, that's obvious to us. In terms of like other possible worlds, like there's a possible world in which I don't exist, or that the desk that I'm sitting at doesn't exist. So it could be that there are like an infinite number of possible worlds out there. And so I guess what we're trying to do with the ontological argument is to show the truth of the first premise. So, like, that is kind of how S5 logic works. And I would it'd be very interesting to look at other ways that it's used for different things. But in terms of necessary things like numbers and logic and gosh dang it, I can't think of anything else. I think like the S5 logic is not just used in the philosophy of religion. I'm fairly certain of that. But yeah, I think the goal is to look at the concept of God and see that if it's even possible at all, logically possible, then we can use the S5 logic to get to the conclusion.
Yeah, this is the problem, because for me, the step from premise 1 to premise 2, I know we had this several times here, and Matt asked you the same question multiple times, but just because something is logically possible, it doesn't seem to me that it's then also that there's a possible word for this. Like, before, I can make up several. I can imagine a lot of words, and I can imagine a word in which no maximally great being exists, and it seems for me logical possible. And then we have this parody argument, and I don't know if logical possibility is the connection to possible words.
Right. I guess I'd have to clarify there then that next between possibilities. Sure. Hmm. Run the. There was something you said about there. Yeah. About a possible world where no maximally great being obtained. I guess my point is that I feel like this doesn't answer your question. Is that the maximally great being has necessary existence, and so the statement, "There's a possible world in which no maximally great being exists," um, is logically incoherent. Matt, do you want to weigh in a little bit? Because I feel like I'm kind of floundering a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So I think fundamentally, at a fundamental level, the modal ontological argument, and I think that your presentation really makes this very clear, it relies on a correlation between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility. Logical possibility meaning simply free from contradiction, metaphysical possibility meaning exists in some possible world. Our world could be such that it exists. And so I think that Kevin's objection is like, well, why think that logical possibility? I mean, and the proponent of the MOA is it's their premise, so they have to justify it. And Kevin's just asking like, well, why think that logical possibility implies or is positively correlated to metaphysical possibility? Why think that? And why not some other option? That seems to be the question. The way that I would weigh in on it is I would say that it seems clear. Like, so for example, Kevin, and I don't think you, maybe you aren't committed to this. It was kind of just something you said as you were presenting your objection. But you said, for example, that we can't know anything about other possible worlds. Well, I think that may betray a misunderstanding about what we mean with possible world semantics. So, for example, surely you know that you could have refrained from logging into this discussion. Like, obviously, you could have not done that. So it seems, and that's a different, in possible world semantics, what we would say is there's some possible world in which Kevin doesn't attend this discussion. And it seems like we know something about that world because we know that you didn't attend the discussion. And so I don't think we want to go so far as to say that we don't know anything about other possible worlds, because it seems if we just reflect on our own experiences, our own knowledge, our own planning, all planning relies on knowledge of possible worlds, right? Because if I invest in, mutual funds for retirement, then it seems like I'm saying there is some possible world in which these mutual funds will go up in value. So, and it seems like that I can know that. I can know that that's possible. And so I think if we just reflect on our experience, we'll see that we certainly can know things about other possible worlds. And then the question that brings us back to the MOA is, okay, well, what principle can we use to say when something's possible when it's not? That seems to be what it is.
Right.
Caleb earlier had suggested imagine. If I can imagine something, then it's metaphysically possible. The reason I would reject that is because you can imagine contradictory things. So I can imagine that God exists and I can imagine that God does not exist. That's one problem. The other problem is imagining things often commits you to other things. So I can imagine, a restaurant with all the tables without also imagining gravity, but nonetheless, all of the tables on the ground in the restaurant implies gravity. And so it's not clear that that what we imagine would not imply God existence. So I can imagine a world with nothing in it. Nonetheless, my imagination, of that world, it implies that God exists in that world because there's a metaphysical foundation for all worlds. And so there would be a metaphysical foundation for that world, and that metaphysical foundation is what we call God. So I think that you have problems with the imagination principle or the imagination criteria. The other one was Graham Oppy's. His principle was, if it's metaphysically possible, it must share a causal history with our own world. Well, that criteria seems to fail because that would lead us to one of two things: either modal collapse, in which case the actual world is the only possible world, and then it would literally be true that it's impossible that Kevin hadn't attended this session. Clearly, it's possible that Kevin did attend the session, so we want to avoid modal collapse. And then we would be left with no knowledge of other possible worlds because we don't know. We don't know what the causal history leads to, and so we wouldn't know. Like, for example, I wouldn't know that it is possible, maybe epistemically possible, but I wouldn't know it's metaphysically possible that stocks go up in value because I don't know what's going to share a causal history with our actual world. And so I think that Graham Oppy's principle would leave us denying knowledge that we obviously have, and so it's a principle to be rejected. And then in the place of those principles, we don't have a better one. The best one that we have on hand is logical possibility. That if something's logically possible, that therefore it's metaphysically possible. We want some principle for possibility, and that seems like a plausible one. And the other alternatives that have been presented, at least in this discussion, don't seem to carry with them liabilities that principle doesn't. And so it seems like that principle is a better one to endorse. And once you have that principle, you're off and running with the MOA argument.
Right. I guess, Kevin, maybe that was really good, by the way. I appreciate that. I guess what I would say then is that we would have to change the first premise to it is metaphysically possible that a maximally great being exists. Maybe that would help a little bit.
Yeah, if we were to formulate the second premise this way, then we would still need to clarify why we can make the step from logically possibility to metaphysically possibility.
Yeah, and then my response was basically the best understanding that we have of metaphysical possibility is that metaphysical possibility is logical possibility. That's what that is, or at least that they're positively correlated.
I think what would seal the deal for me would be if premise one wasn't just it's logically possible that a maximally great being exists, but also that it's logically impossible that no maximally great being exists. And if we were to prove that premise, then I can see that the rest follows.
Right.
So, what you're saying is you'll only accept the argument if it leads to an atheistic conclusion. Is that what you meant to say?
No,
Well,
it's a great argument.
You
So long
misunderstood
as
me.
it proves atheism.
I think you misunderstood me.
Yeah.
The premise would need to be it's logically possible that a maximally great being exists, and it's logically impossible that no maximally great being exists.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is what that premise says.
No, it's not.
Well, it's not worded that. It doesn't. That's what that premise entails.
I think they convey the same idea though, and that's the idea. So once you get like the gist, it doesn't really matter how you word it. Like it is not in boy lot dinosaur possible. I don't know. But yeah, essentially those two premises are saying the same thing.
All right, Kevin, I'll give you. We're kind of pushing time here, so I'll let you have a final word, and then we'll let Nick make any kind of closing comments, and then we'll go ahead and call it for today.
Okay, sure. I think this last conversation kind of showed to me where I actually see the problem with the ontological problem argument and what would need to be shown for me to say it's sound. So this conversation was helpful.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. And then, yeah, Nick, did you have any final comments you wanted to make? Any final clarifications before we call it a day?
Well, yeah. So first, I want to say that this argument is really fun to think about, and I appreciate y'all coming and listening. Scott and Kevin, it was especially enjoyable engaging with y'all. And I hope that you take more time, look at the resources that I've provided. The last resource is a bit of a joke, but hey, that might relate to another talk that I might give on the argument from Beatty. Who knows? But yeah, take time to consider what is it like. Think about the questions. What does it mean for God to be maximally great? What does it mean to be God? And is it possible? Because there's a Ben Arbor had this excellent summation at the end of his interview with Capturing Christianity. Because if it's possible that God exists, just like think about the potential consequences of that. You have a morally perfect and all-knowing, very, very powerful being who cares about creation, is bringing it to a conclusion, and that his creation even has value, that it's beautiful, and we're called to a moral standard. And there are lots of very good things, I think, that come about to the existence of God. So, like, if God exists, then he cares about us and he wants to be in relationship with us. I might be bringing in my my Christian convictions a little bit too much. I don't know, but yeah, just think about like what would it mean if God existed, and just see if that doesn't get you thinking. And yeah, thanks for listening.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Nick, and thanks everybody who's attending or listening later online. I really appreciate you, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
All right, bye y'all.